So I'm going to switch things up a little bit here. I dream of the day where we can have women in engineering presentations that no longer have to focus on the barriers that women face, but instead on the great work that we do. And I think we're going to get there through representation. And that's going to look like amazing women working on awesome projects so that the next generation's like, you know what? I can do that. So as a self-declared awesome woman, this is my amazing project, the Stanley Milner Library. This is it back in 1967 when it was first being constructed. And as you can see here, it's a little bit of a fortress. This was the style of the day, though. The architects love this. It's called brutalism. I kid you not. This really tried to show off structure, and as a structural engineer, I'm all for that, and it was showing off concrete, while also being functional and protecting the books with this dark space. However, today's libraries, they don't need that. Today's libraries get to be a nice open space where, you really get to celebrate community. You have access to things like technology and resources, and it's maybe less about the books, but about some of the great things that you can do in spaces like this. So how do we get here? Well, the architects went through a journey, as they do, with a bunch of different concepts, and they're like, well, what's signature about Edmonton? Edmonton's cold. So they were inspired by frost. So those tendrils that you see, some of those nice planar structures, and as structural engineers, we're like, we can get on board with this. So we decided, you know what, let's embrace this through a system of trusses. So you can see here, we've got 3 trusses. Some of these are 4 stories high. They're crossing across the building all the way through, and it's supporting this amazing facade by tying back to the existing column system. So when we, as structural engineers, go to design this, we're approaching it from those final loading conditions. So that means you've got your floors in place, you've got people walking around, you've got some heavy library stacks. And this has a tendency to make your beams deflect. So, you want a nice flat floor, so we're going to camber that up so that you have that nice straight beam. But what this looks like in construction, without those loads, is assembling a bunch of bent sticks. This is a challenge. And so throughout the construction process, I had to go to these meetings at milestones being like, this is how the building's deflecting now. Does this line up with your model? Now, when we were talking about deflection, one of the areas that came up is this reading ramp. So it's beautiful. It's open. It's a nice, slender structure. But as structural engineers, this is kind of at odds, because you have people walking along, and that creates rhythm, which if you're reading on this ramp, is super annoying. So to get rid of this, we had to find creative ways to inject stiffness into the structure. And that meant creative ways to support this ramp. So you can see we're connecting into the truss, and that's a bunch of steel coming together to a point. So that's complex geometry that we had to work through and fit and be flexible with. So I'm going to draw your attention to our site plan up top. If you'll notice, this is a picture of the Milner Library, and next to that, that is the Coliseum, the original one downtown. It's not there anymore, but that tells you how old these drawings were. So old, in fact, that we didn't have the 2nd floor, we didn't have the 3rd floor, but the architect is like, this is a feature space. We want to cut giant holes in this to open it up and make it nice and light. So as you can imagine, this is a bit of a problem. But we're like, we got this. We got this. We're going to add some beams. We're going to tie back to the columns. And this will totally work out. But what this looks like in construction is, on my drawings, I have a bunch of assumptions being like, oh, this beam is this size. OK, it's got this reinforcing. All right, now prove it. So you have to be creative. You have to investigate a little bit. So we had to employ a multitude of techniques. So this involved X-ray scanning. This involved literally chopping into our beam, counting the bars, measuring them, and being like, yep, that's what we've got. And sometimes what it also meant is trial and error. Please do not lose any of my reinforcing bars. So this is what we had to do, what we had to work with. Now, when we removed all of the cladding of this existing structure, we kind of lost some of our lateral protection. So what we were using to protect against wind and seismic loads. We had to replace this with steel braces, which then tied back to the existing concrete columns. This is a bit of a challenge, you might imagine, and we had our engineering solution, and then the guys on site were like, nah, it needs to be more constructible. And so finally we arrived on this solution, which was a nice compromise. Engineers were happy, the site guys were living with it. Now, all of this was really a lot of work, but as you can see, this is where we're at today. And I think that we have made a ton of progress going from that building, 1967 fortress, to where we are today. And I think this parallels the journey that women have made in this industry. Starting back in 1967, I don't imagine that there were any women on this job, let alone any women as young as I am. And we couldn't have done this project without huge amounts of collaboration and talking back and forth. And I think that's similar to how women aren't going to make it in this industry without that same level of open communication and talking back and forth. So that collaboration was key. And on this project, we had some great architects with TPL and Stantec, but what I really appreciated was how many other women were with me on this job. There was a female electrical engineer, a female mechanical design engineer. I had my first all-woman technical email. It was so empowering. And even just the opportunity to work on this job has just blown my mind. Having a company that trusts you, that believes in you, and says you can do it, that is empowering beyond words. I hope all of you have been similarly empowered by this presentation. Thank you.